unmuted.
Okay,
You
cool.
are now
Cool.
muted.
So, welcome to this presentation, Adopting Free Software Ideals by Mike Gerwitz. A short bio. Mike is a user freedom activist with a focus on user privacy and security, an assistant on GNU+linux and the GNU project, and a member of the GNU Advisory Committee. He writes free software and uses exclusively free software in his day-to-day computing. Mike is a software engineer by profession, but a hacker at heart. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone, and thank you for to the FSF for having me back again this year. Well, I am coming to you as an activist today, and in this talk will, hopefully provide some advice to others like me. I'm also a author and a user of free software, and I'd say a user foremost, since that's what I do each and every day, which is use free software. But it took me a long time to get where I am today, and it was not easy. Us activists, try to put on a straight face and paint a positive picture of everything and neglect inconvenient truths. And by not admitting to our own faults, we risk setting unattainable standards that might drive others away from our movement. And that's really what this talk is about, some of those hard problems of software freedom, the process of adopting and incorporating those ideals into your own life, ascribing them meaning and identity within the context of everything else that's important to you, and then maybe even advocating for them too. So first, what ideals am I talking about? I won't go over the 4 freedoms, but within the context of free software, that's what we're talking about, the freedoms to run, study, modify, and share your software. And we repeat this again and again, but what really are we talking about fundamentally? And it's as simple as we reject being controlled by those who write software. We believe that everyone should be free to do their own computing how they please, not how somebody else pleases. For a lot of people, though, this isn't an easy concept to grasp. I mean, if we think about the devices users most often use, which is a phone, they're like these magical black boxes. They can't reason about how the apps run, how the underlying operating system runs, that there is even such a thing as an operating system. And part of that is a lack of computer literacy in our cultures, which is not the subject of this talk, but would certainly help. But quickly, what is an app? An app is a program. A program is a sequence of instructions written by a human, at least for now. So someone else is instructing your device what to do. And since computers and devices are effectively extensions of us, they determine what we can and cannot do, how we can and cannot act, and what we can and cannot see. I want to tell you a little story. I was talking to my wife a few weeks ago, preparing for this talk, and she cut me off, and I thought maybe she wasn't interested in what I had to say, but as it turns out, she had something pretty, well, it stuck with me. She's a nurse. She works at a hospital, partly dealing with COVID-19 patients. So I also want to take a moment to express my gratitude to all the healthcare workers that are really holding the fabric of our society together during this pandemic. And she was talking to her coworkers about some of the computing we do here. For example, my kids really enjoy playing Mind Test, which is a free replacement for a popular game of a similar name. And one of her aides came by and asked if we used what he called Linux, which we prefer to call GNU+linux. And my wife, up to this point, hadn't used the term free software. Yet he said, "I love the concept of free software." And that really stuck with me. And it's a really powerful message. Let me explain why. I've been programming professionally for about 12, 13 years. And in that time, with all the coworkers I've had, with the dozens of interviews that I have given, I haven't heard such a strong message from people within my own circle. And these are people who are usually aware of open source, but not necessarily software freedom. Yet this non-technical person, and I say that because he then went to describe how his device came with Chrome installed and he wasn't sure how to uninstall it. He's already internalized this concept. And this stuck with me because this is one of the hardest parts of my activism, trying to figure out how to get people to care about free software. And he's already done that. Now, it was also very interesting to me how it seems that my activism was more effective in this case through my wife's inadvertent advocacy. And why is that? So part of it is because she was there and I wasn't. So certainly the more people that we can have advocating on our behalf, the fewer places we have to be. But there's something a little more fundamental than that. So since we're on the topic of healthcare, we can compare it to perhaps vaccine hesitancy. So for whatever reason, whether it be legitimate concerns or misinformation, certain people don't want to get a COVID-19 vaccine, at least here within the US. And how do you go about combating something like that? Well, it's not going to be coming from the government entities that people distrust. It's going to have to come from people within their community leaders, their friends, their family, the people who understand their concerns and can address them more intimately and speak to them and set a good example. Me, as an activist, it's very difficult for me to relate to how certain people do their computing. So my wife can bond and culturally have conversations with the people she works with and relate to them. Me, I mean, let me tell you what I'm streaming on right now. It's an old X200 ThinkPad, which is about a decade old. It's running LibrePlanet, so free from the BIOS up. I'm running GNU Geek system, which is a free GNU+linux distribution. I use a tiling window manager most of the time, just a full screen terminal. I'm SSH'd into a box in my basement where I do most of my work. And my phone that is running Replicant. It's a Galaxy S3, which is also about a decade old. It's run the front-facing camera drivers do not work. The rear-facing camera barely works. Can't take video. Can't watch video. The wireless drivers don't work. GPS doesn't work. This is not a practical device for your average user. It's just something I chose because of how much I value my freedom. And then, when it comes to the web, I don't allow any JavaScript to run, which severely limits the sites that I can interact with. But even so, by privilege of my knowledge as a web developer over the past 15 years or so, I'm still able to do more than your average user would be able to. How I do my computing is entirely unrelatable. I lament that I cannot recommend my practices, how I've attained my freedom, to others. So another thing to note is my wife, even though she was effective in her advocacy, she doesn't even use free software herself. She's aware of the concepts. After all, she lives with me and I'm an activist. She doesn't like how people have control over her computing, but it's not enough to change how she does her computing. And she doesn't like change. So I made an analogy that she likes, which is, and to be clear, this is something completely unrelated to the concept of software freedom. But my wife and I, for years, have wanted to explore, being vegetarian or vegan, just for ethical reasons. But we haven't done so. So if we were to be approached by a, say, vegan activist, they wouldn't be effective because we already agree. We already understand. We already think it's important. Why haven't we changed then? Because it's hard to change something you've been doing for the past 30 years. And I know that sounds like an excuse, but that is the reality. And that's how my wife thinks about software freedom. So when you're familiar with software freedom for a long time, like I have been, it's easy to forget where you've come from. So I think about this a lot as a professional too. Because as we're onboarding new people, I lack that beginner perspective anymore. I miss certain obvious things. I've become myopic. So to get from A to Z in the context of software freedom, it's a process. It's a journey. It takes a lot of effort, and in the case of software freedom, completely changing how one does their computing, how one lives their life. It doesn't just happen. Further, we're always evolving. So I used LibreBoot as an example. A free BIOS didn't used to be possible, and now it is. That goal has shifted. So I didn't start with free software. When I was a kid, I grew up with Windows. So I started programming about 20 years ago now using a proprietary language, Microsoft Visual Basic 6. And as a kid, I did what kids do best, which is mimic. I sought to follow the examples of the world that was around me. So that included license keys and quotas and directing the user in ways that I wanted the user to act. I don't have time to go into my whole life story, so I'm going to skip ahead to when I first discovered the concept of software freedom. So at some point, the laptop I was using started having hard drive issues. And for those who don't know, hard drives are these spinning metal platters in an enclosure. It started making a grinding noise, which is very bad. So while I waited for a replacement, I wanted to continue using my laptop. And I found that GNU and Linux distros, which I simply knew as Linux at the time, I wasn't yet aware of GNU, have bootable live CDs. So you put in the CD and it runs out of memory without needing a hard drive at all. And that alone kind of blew me away. But as I got into it more, I was also fascinated by the level of customization that I could perform in the OS. I think it was KDE that I was using at the time. And it came with, as operating systems usually do, a number of games. And one of the games I really liked was called Frozen Bubble. Now, part of what happened next maybe have been a little bit of luck, but I was digging into the file system a bit, and I found where on disk, or in memory, again, my disk was broken, Frozen Bubble was. Now, most programs, or not necessarily most, but a lot are compiled. So they produce machine code that the computer then runs. So if you open it in, say, a text editor, you're going to get what kind of looks like garbage. But this was different. When I opened Frozen Bubble, I got source code, not minified or obfuscated source code. No, source code that looked like it was intended for a human to modify it. Now, I wasn't familiar with the language at the time, which is Perl, but I was blown away. I mean, I came from Windows where you did not get that. You got games, you didn't get the source code to them. So I was curious if maybe I was mistaken in something. So I modified the file. And again, I didn't know Perl, so I made some trivial change, maybe a text change. And I restarted the game, and sure enough, there was my change. And I was floored. I was really excited, but I wanted to know more. Why? Is this something the developer intended? Did I, kind of just work around the system? Or so I scrolled to the top of the file, and there was a copyright notice there. And it said something very different than what I was used to, which is I had permission to modify and distribute this software. And the license was the GNU General Public License, version 2, and it said it was published by the Free Software Foundation. So I knew I had the technical means to modify the software, but now I was given permission to. And that was empowering. So while my memory is a little blurry on the details after that, that was the beginning of my looking into the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation and the philosophy behind software freedom. I had a lot of unlearning to do for myself at this point because I had been, indoctrinated in Windows and in Visual Studio and so on, and I didn't have anyone to guide me. I did have now the FSF in GNU to serve as a beacon of light, as an anchor, or as a lighthouse, as Snowden put it in his keynote. It gave me something to work toward, to constantly improve upon. But it didn't give me advice that was practical at the time. Now, that word, practical, is probably setting off alarm bells for certain people in the free software community. So let me explain. Because people often say that free software is not practical. Not just our opponents, though, but also people who want to actually use free software. Now, we counter, saying we've done it. I mentioned I have here. The FSF is carrying out an entire conference with entirely free software. We're doing it now as I speak. Clearly, it works. But we have to be careful. What's our goal? Are we trying to help? Are we being defensive when we say we've done it? Are we bragging? We have to be careful not to dismiss users' legitimate concerns. So I just mentioned how my computing today is not relatable. What I consider to be practical for myself is absolutely not practical for someone without the requisite understanding. So imagine me 15 years ago when I was first discovering this. Someone telling me they're already there. No, it is practical. I've done it. Okay, good for you. I know the goal, but help me get where you are. Don't just dismiss me. So we have to be practical about what we consider to be practical for other people, especially those less experienced than us or less technical than us. And I want you to keep that concept in mind because we're going to continue to explore it as we move on. I also want to pause for a moment and talk about the license. So we touched on Frozen Bubble specifically. So we touched on the ideals of software freedom previously, but how's that actually enforced? So software is covered by copyright law. Copyright grants a rather long monopoly over the ability to make copies, which also includes derivative works. So by default, software is non-free, it's proprietary. To grant users back the freedoms that we believe they ought to have, Richard Stallman turned copyright on its head with the concept of copyleft. I don't think the term originated with him, but this philosophy is really what's embodied within the GPL, the General Public License, and now other licenses as well. Now, some developers write free software for just technical reasons, and that's really the focus of open source. But other people write it for philosophical reasons, and some write it as a form of advocacy or as a form of activism. So what happened here with Frozen Bubble? Well, this is what led me to discover software freedom, the license, this game. And I can't say what the intentions of the developers were, but that's what happened. So those of you who do write software may never know how much of an impact you're actually having on something that seems as simple as a license choice. And that's why the choice of license is so important. Choosing the GPL isn't just about ensuring that your software remains free. It's also about making a statement, about advocating for the principles and ideals of software freedom. There's another aspect before I move on from Frozen Bubble that I want to emphasize. So when I discovered that the software was free, I also wanted to test that. What are the practical benefits of it being free? Or what can I actually do with it? And the fact that I could just open the file and change it really lowered the barrier to entry. So when we think about software freedom, let's not just think about it in terms of licensing. Let's also consider practical freedoms, how to make the freedom to study and modify the software available to more users or even non-programmers. So that doesn't mean writing all your software in a scripting language, but I mean, it could help. But it does mean being mindful of what you're doing. So developing maybe some proper abstractions so that you don't have to reason about the entirety of the program, document the design and philosophy of your program, how it works. Just try to think of ways to empower as many users as you can. And this is a skill that takes time. And some people never quite get there. I mean, I develop software for a living. I have to work with teams of people. It can be hard. What's important, though, is that you're just always thinking of those practical freedoms for the user and in keeping free software software freedom at the heart of what you do. So if we go back to my story, one of the most notorious problems users have when switching to GNU and Linux is the issue of wireless drivers. Not just wireless drivers, there's also video and such, but I only have so much time here to talk, so I'm going to focus on wireless. So back in the day, I had to use a tool called NDIS Wrapper, which was free software that could load Windows XP drivers on GNU and Linux for my wireless card. But the drivers for Windows were non-free. Nowadays, the situation seems much better in that if you just use a bootable CD for a popular GNU and Linux distro, you may find your hardware just works. But there's a catch, because that's usually because the kernel Linux comes with a bunch of binary blobs, which is a term we give to these opaque and non-free objects within them. There is a Linux Libre project which strips those blobs to actually provide a fully free kernel, but then users may find that certain software doesn't work. So generally, the recommendation for Wi-Fi on a Linux-based system is to use a card or a dongle like this one that's based on the Atheros chipset. And so in one sense, our situation has improved drastically from what it was 15 years ago. I can carry this around and plug it in, or get one that, my laptop has one that's made to be used inside it instead of a USB dongle sticking out. But that's if you have money. And so we have a problem. So on one hand, it's better, but on the other hand, what about the people who can't afford to buy this? I forget what I paid for this. It might have been around $40. Or what about the people who want to repurpose old hardware? So e-waste, for example, is something people consider to be a major ethical issue. In those cases, they may have systems that are fully free, with the exception of the wireless drivers. So let's think about something. Let's think about someone who's just starting to dip their toe into GNU and Linux or free software. They want to use hardware they already have, right? Now purchase something else just to give it a try. But if they use a distribution that we recommend, so me as an activist or the FSF on their list of endorsed distributions, then their hardware may not work. So what do we tell them? And I'm not going to answer that right now. I want you to sit on that one too. We're starting to develop a theme here. We'll be coming back to it. So the next step for me was trying to move off of Windows. So around this time, I had a desktop that I built in addition to my laptop, and I was dual booting Windows and GNU and Linux. So for those who don't know, dual booting means that when I start my system, I was presented with a menu, and I could choose whether to boot into Windows or boot into GNU and Linux. And why would I do that after having a taste of the freedom? Why would I still want to go into Windows? And the simple answer is that old habits die hard. It takes time to upend the computing you've done for so long and learning new ways to do things. This is an incremental process. But the biggest thing that kept me booting into Windows at that time, so this is 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there years ago, 15. Anyway, it was a popular MMO, and I'm not going to name it, but I was quite addicted to it at the time. Games are influential. I'm not even a gamer, and I've already mentioned games twice so far. Frozen Bubble for making me aware of software freedom, and this MMO for keeping me on Windows. And here's the third one. When I first started programming 20 years ago, it's because of another game I played, Laser Tank, which had a level editor, and I wanted to break outside of it. I wanted to be able to do more than what that level editor allowed me to do. So I want to stay on this topic of games for just a little bit, because it's an important one. There's a number of aspects to games beyond just addiction that make it a little bit different from other software. Games are more than just software. They're also art. And with that, there's some additional complexities. It may be challenging to find a free replacement for a game because of surrounding trademarks. For example, my kids sometimes want to play games because they contain characters that they recognize from shows or movies. And it's not that it's impossible to make free software to replicate those games. It absolutely is, and there are plenty of examples. But they're not necessarily of practical use to my children if the reason they want to play it are those characters. And then to further complicate things, many AAA titles have budgets in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars, and seem to be more like interactive movies. Now, that's something the free software community is not currently well positioned to counter. And it's not that we can't, but to counter such a massive undertaking, we need many more people who believe in our ideals and are willing to work toward it. And then there's something else. Games are something that people gather around and enjoy together. They can be ingrained in culture, whether it be culture at large or smaller groups. Getting rid of a game or replicating it with something free may also mean challenging all of your friends to also play it. So we have this problem with social networks too. What good is a social network that none of your peers use? I avoid a lot of these problems by breaking social norms or simply not associating with certain people. And I'm okay with doing this, but many people aren't or can't. I used the vegan metaphor previously, but the metaphor is a little shallow. So consider a party. So if you're a vegan and they're serving meat, then you could still participate in the party, but just not eat that meal, or bring your own, which is kind of like what I do with free software. But with certain games like MMOs or popular social networks, the software isn't just a component of a social event. It is the social event. It's the means of communication. There's no abstaining from or substituting while also communicating. Severing non-free software in such cases may mean severing social ties, unless there happens to be free software that is compatible. And sometimes there is, but oftentimes there isn't. And while I've done that, and I'm okay with it, that's me. We can't demand or expect that of others. We need to work with people to adopt replacements to help them, to help move their community to another platform that respects their freedom, so that then they can all enjoy freedom together. Freedom shouldn't have to mean isolation from one's peers just because they don't hold the same ideals, right? Not to mention that just creates echo chambers and also then removes our voice from that community, or the ability for that person to advocate. It perpetuates or even possibly worsens that divide. However, despite my simply avoiding certain situations, there are certain things that I cannot escape from and that I have no choice but to confront head on. Dramatic pause for the water, I suppose. Let's take schools, for example. There was a talk earlier today on the problem of non-free software in schools that I recommend you take a look at. But let's say you live in a school district where students use non-free software or services, which nowadays is very likely, more likely than not. So first, there's something you have to understand. The school has already invested money, if it's a public school, taxpayer money, into the hardware, the services, the training of staff and students. They've put data into the platform. And given all of that, one person, like me, voicing their dissent isn't going to change that. It's too expensive. In my case, I arrived too late to my district to voice any input on that process. I did meet with assistant superintendents of the district to voice my concerns. But again, I'm just one person. Why are my ideals more important than the opinions of others? But what if it were different? What if there were dozens of parents or more? Could have possibly prevented this before it happened. There would have been a louder voice. They don't have to even subscribe fully to our ideals. They just need to know enough to advocate for them, to care, like my wife did in her position. And they may not necessarily care about freedom for themselves, but maybe they'll care about it for their children. Kind of like how we'll eat whatever we want, but we want our kids to eat healthy because that's what's good for them. But how do we get those parents? Through advocacy. But what advice do we offer to those parents who are in that situation today? Do we just say, don't let your child use non-free software? I put the social and emotional well-being of my children above my ideals of software freedom. And I suspect that most, if not all, of parents do the same. But by forcing your child to participate in your activism when they're too young to understand is not looking out for their best interests. Now, if they're old enough to understand and want to do so on their own, that's great. Encourage that and have them do so. But if they're young, like mine, then having them do things differently in class than the other kids is just going to increase social anxiety, decrease their learning, possibly open them up to ridicule. It's one thing to ask myself to be strong in that situation. It's another thing to ask my child to be. So we find ourselves in this situation that unless we can connect with parents and offer them better guidance than simply don't use non-free software, they're going to just see us as extremists and not engage. And the situation will simply perpetuate. And the reason this is so important is because this is one of the core ways that non-free software continues through the generations. These companies get a stronghold within schools, knowing that if they teach kids how to use this software and indoctrinate them in it, they're going to be using that outside of school as well. I mentioned previously, people don't like change. So odds are quite high. And back in the day, it was Microsoft and Sun. Today, it's more like Google. That's what they're going to use going forward. And then this simply compounds over and over. There was a comment in IRC actually for one of the previous talks saying that even some of the parents were considered positive for things like Microsoft and Google's products to be taught in school because that's what's used in real life. And yes, that's true, but we can change that. Imagine though if we taught freedom in school, sharing. Imagine the impact that might have on our activism and advocacy. The job would be done for us by professional educators who know how best to educate and who work within these communities, as I was mentioned before, not just some voice on the screen like me who can't necessarily relate to your position. Now there's a question I want to consider carefully because it's loaded and it's something a lot of people ask themselves. Am I a bad person for using non-free software? Well, why is non-free software bad? Is it the program itself? Well, when you liberate a program, when you make it free, that code does not have to change. So clearly the program itself isn't the problem. What changes is the license. Copyright, and in some cases patents and trademarks, take away freedoms that we would otherwise have. But a free software license grants those freedoms back. From whom, though? Who is relinquishing that power? The copyright holder, or the patent, or the trademark holder. They are the ones that otherwise can tell us what we can and cannot do. They exercise their rights over us as an instrument of power. That is why it's bad. The power they have over us when we use non-free software. So users of non-free software aren't bad people, but we do sometimes describe them as victims. Now, we have to be careful, though, in the terminology that we use, because people who don't hold ideals as strongly as we do may not like being called victims, because if they're putting themselves in the situation that they're in, if they want to be using the software or services that they're using, I mean, would you want to be called a victim in that case? So it kind of implies that they have poor judgment. It may offend them. So some people don't want to be labeled victims or bad people. And that's really about using judgment. Make sure you adjust your terminology for your particular situation. We have a lot of terminology that we think works well for us because it really invokes emotion and really describes how we feel about non-free software. But it can be off-putting to those who aren't quite there yet. They may agree with you eventually, but they need some time. Throughout this talk, there's been a common theme, and I've said I'd revisit certain things. So we have these ideals, and there are challenges toward meeting them. And sometimes guidance on these ideals can be hard to come by until you reach a certain point, because us as activists, or the Free Software Foundation, or GNU, as entities that want to instill these ideals in their purest form, don't want to risk guiding users towards something that is non-free. This necessarily means that in the process of adopting free software, that unless you find yourself in a rather remarkable position, you're going to find yourself using non-free software as you try to figure out how to do without, despite being ideologically opposed to it. And when this gets tough, it's tempting to justify your use of non-free software in a particular case by reframing the issue, or possibly diluting your ideals by saying that certain parts of these free software ideals aren't important after all. Please never dilute your ideals. Never. Don't make excuses when you don't meet them. Own up to it. Otherwise, you risk becoming complacent, and then you may stagnate in your progress. I made this mistake when I was starting out. In the case of video drivers, for example, I decided because I wanted to use that particular video card that it didn't matter that the drivers were non-free. And because of that, for a while, I stagnated in my growth as a free software user. I wasn't an activist back then, but that could have preempted that as well. So instead, set your goals high, knowing that you're going to fail to meet them for quite some time, because you probably are. The odds are against you. The world is currently against you. Keep your goals strong, though. This is what organizations like the FSF and GNU are good for. They don't leave any question as to where those ideals stand. They are unwavering. And then when you do make progress toward your goals, be proud of the progress you've made, however much or however little, and be happy with the freedom that you have gained. Struggling with my mouse a little bit here. Sorry about that. I mentioned that the world's against you, and in one way it's true, but in another, maybe I shouldn't phrase it like this. Because I used to look at everyone embracing non-free software in the world with anger and with cynicism. But in reality, it's just that most people don't know about these issues or understand why they're important or should be adopted. When you see schools embracing non-free software and services, or your employer, or advertisements for non-free software, or your friends or family members using a proprietary program, rather than getting angry, take it as a call to action. Help them to understand. Because if you immediately jump in and use terminology that's too strong, it's going to be off-putting, and you risk losing them as an audience. Not all of us may find it within ourselves to be as free as, say, someone like Richard Stallman. We all lead different lives under different circumstances. But what we should all strive to do is to help one another in the spirit of freedom, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. But why do we have trouble with our freedoms? Is it because it's impractical? Well, impracticality is a self-fulfilling prophecy, not at the level of an individual, but as a society as a whole. All these issues that I brought up here are of humanity's own making. Non-free software is not a law of nature. Copyright is not a law of nature. It's non-free because we allow it to be so. And it doesn't have to stay that way. I certainly hope it doesn't. If enough of us speak out, we can change that over time. The smallest steps toward freedom add up. We don't all need to be purists. We all need to just be aware and care. And since my job primarily now as a dad, I could not help but to add a Dr. Seuss quote in here from the Lorax, which is, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. There are a lot of things that I wanted to include in this talk that I had to get rid of for time. And rather than trying to just shove as much in as possible, I figured it might be better to let some of the attendees guide the conversation a little bit. So if you have any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, here are some topics I could rant on about otherwise. But otherwise, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Great talk. In the IRC channel, people really enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot for this. Questions. So one of the first comments was the fact that one must totally change their life to live in freedom is definitely a big problem. We can't people expect to totally change their behaviors by seeing polymer. Do you want to comment on this one?
Yes, the simple answer is no, we can't expect people to change their lives. And the reason is because, and this is something I struggled with for a long time, because free software is so important to me. When I first discovered it, I thought everybody must think this way. Everybody must want this. I remember reading a thread on Reddit well over a decade ago with people railing on free software and what they perceived as the problems with it. And I couldn't even comprehend it. I did not understand how everybody couldn't agree with these ideals. And in doing so, I think I've been a very ineffective activist in certain ways for all of this time, because having users change their lives, you will occasionally get the person who does agree with our ideals as much as we do, and a lot of you are probably here right now in this conference, but the majority of the population won't. Or maybe eventually they will, but it's going to take time to come around. Or maybe they secretly do, but there's too much peer pressure. It's too impractical for them to, because they have other ideals or other things in their life that they hold more important than free software. So what we have to do is we need enough people that care about particular issues to write free replacements that are suitable for those who don't have the ideals as strong as we do. And in certain ways that projects like Mastodon can help serve as Twitter replacements, PeerTube, and such. A lot of these problems that try to tackle social issues, it's not necessarily the lack of technology in those cases. People don't adopt them, again, because that's not where their communities are. So no, we can't expect that to happen, but it's an unfortunate reality that we're in right now, and that has to change.
Yeah. Actually, in parallel, the IRC is getting quite active now on this question, and also related questions such as, where was it? Advice on how to approach people who have very different ideas and are in a different position. And one comment was perhaps the importance of empathy and advocacy is the primary message here. And yeah, I think this is a good point.
Yeah, I agree. And again, so I want to be clear, I'm not railing, I don't want to rail against the FSF or Richard Stallman or any of the people that I admire very dearly. They have their place as, again, this lighthouse, something that we all need to look toward. But that doesn't mean that their example is effective in all cases. We need people, again, in these that are effective at communicating to different types of people. And certainly there are situations where you need to sit down with someone, understand their concerns, have a deep conversation with them, relate to them. And that might mean putting some of your ideals on the back burner, because you might have to make a recommendation to them that you would not make to yourself. But that moves them ever closer to, slightly closer to freedom. And then you can just keep building upon that. Take them by the hand, support them, and then maybe eventually they'll get there. But if you don't do that, they're just going to shut you down completely right off the bat, and then you get nowhere.
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks. Different question from Yastif. Do you block discourse forum software too? 23% of that are written in JavaScript.
I'm sorry, what was the very beginning of the question?
If you block discourse forum software.
Yeah, so just JavaScript in general, should I speak to that? A lot of the web, yes, today requires JavaScript to function either properly or at all, and JavaScript is most of the JavaScript served is non-free. So I gave a talk on this 2016, if you're interested in it, because we're probably running tight on time. But when you visit a web page, you're automatically downloading and executing these non-free programs on your computer. And the problem is your average user can't, let's say we give them LibreJS or something. What's going to happen is the web breaks for them. And just handing them that and telling them good luck is not really a viable option. They're not going to stick with that. If they consider freedom to be very important, then they might end up suffering and deciding that they can't use the web, and that's that. And I hope we can improve upon that. But improving upon the situation as a whole so that the average user can continue to use the web in freedom requires a massive cultural shift for all these organizations that are writing the non-free software to begin with. It's not as simple as advocating at an individual level.
Agreed, yeah. Which question to choose next? Maybe one. Do you foresee it becoming more difficult to make or encourage the switch to full freedom, given that there are so many X200s or Galaxy S2s left in the world? Are you optimistic about any fully free computing or mobile phone projects?
I am. So first of all, again, I have an X200. I love it. Because it's good for what I do. But actually, even in this talk, I had to reduce the video quality because it's not suitable for doing the transcoding and stuff expected of modern. It can't keep up with my webcam. So this is not suitable for everybody. We need modern hardware. And I am optimistic for the progress being made for certain companies. what people call open hardware. I prefer to be called free hardware, so we have a focus on freedom. That didn't used to be a concern of a focus for the Free Software Foundation and such, because it at the time wasn't practical. Now people are actually coming up with free hardware designs and such, and systems designed to work with free software. For example, Purism has gotten a number of respect to freedom certifications from the FSF. And I love that the FSF came up with that concept. When I'm looking for new hardware, that's where I look first, with the caveat that certain things are not adequate for your average user. So, and as far as phones go, I'm optimistic for the Librem 5, which has received the FSF's endorsement. There are other projects as well. I know there's the Pine phone and such, but I don't think they're fully free. But I see, I'm hesitant to speak on certain things because I don't want to say something incorrect. So somebody please correct me if that is not true. So I'm hopeful, but I think that the current, again, recommending X200s and Galaxy S3s to everyone is not the way to go.
Yeah. Right. Thanks. I also had a question. So you talk a lot, or I do also, these gradual changes towards free software, but there are huge steps I didn't dare to take yet. So for example, ditching Microsoft Office at work, or going to a full Libre mobile OS. Do you have any advice on how to tackle such things, these big steps?
So if it's just a matter of Office can largely be replaced by something like LibreOffice. I find that the employers using non-free software, that's a talk in its own. But as an example, my employer does use non-free software in certain cases, and I advocate for using free software when I can. But as an employee, I'm acting on behalf of my employer. If they choose to use non-free software, they're losing out on their freedoms. It isn't my personal computing. But in doing so, I have for example, for Office. So I try to do all of my work at my employer within a virtual machine, running GNU+linux, using exclusively free software. And LibreOffice is one of the things that I do run. I open these fairly exotic documents from a lot of for business requirements and all of these things, and they function just fine. Now, I'm sure there are features that are missing, but for the most part, LibreOffice is something that does actually work pretty well day to day. I'm sure if you talk to somebody who's, say, an expert in Excel or something and uses all these advanced features, maybe there are certain things that don't work. But I think that you could play with making that step. Just start using LibreOffice, and then maybe fall back to Office if it isn't working for you, and just keep trying to use it more and more and figure out what are those features that don't work and what can you live without, and work toward getting toward freedom.
Thanks, that makes sense. Yeah. So I think I've brought up all the relevant questions. If I forgot any, please tell me in IRC. I think we should also wrap up the call. We are 5 minutes over time
Okay.
already. Yeah, so thanks a lot, everybody, for joining. Thanks a lot, Mike, for the great presentation. It was awesome to listen to you.
Thank you.
And yeah, talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for hearing me out on some uncomfortable topics.